In the quiet hours of the night, when the world slows and thoughts begin to drift, there are certain names that seem to echo through history long after the noise around them has faded. Names spoken softly, almost cautiously, because of what they represent. One such name is FREEWAY Rick Ross. It is a name tied not to a single street or city, but to an era, a transformation, and a shadow that stretched across America. His story is not loud in the way action films are loud. It is slower, heavier, and far more unsettling when told calmly, piece by piece, as it unfolds into something much larger than one man. Before the headlines, before the courtrooms and prison cells, before the whispered accusations of government involvement and national consequence, there was simply a boy growing up in South Central Los Angeles. A boy surrounded by concrete, limited choices, and a system that seemed distant at best, indifferent at worst. At the time, no one could have predicted that this boy would one day be blamed for helping to ignite one of the most devastating drug epidemics in American history. And yet, history often turns not on grand designs, but on small decisions made quietly, late at night, when survival feels more urgent than morality. FREEWAY Rick Ross did not begin as a villain in his own story. In fact, for much of his early life, crime was not about power or greed, but about necessity and adaptation. His journey forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How does a person with no formal education build an empire that outpaces law enforcement for years? How does a street-level dealer become a central figure in a national tragedy? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many unseen forces must align for such a rise to even be possible? As you listen, it's important to understand that this is not a story told in extremes. There are no simple heroes or villains here. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of choices, each one leading naturally to the next, like stepping stones laid across a dark river. From the outside, it may appear inevitable. From the inside, it often felt like the only path forward. That tension, between inevitability and responsibility, lies at the heart of this story. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, America was changing. Cities were struggling, factories were closing, and entire neighborhoods were being left behind. South Central Los Angeles was one of those places where opportunity felt distant, almost mythical. Schools were underfunded, jobs were scarce, and the streets became classrooms of their own. For many young men, learning how to hustle was less a choice and more a form of education. It taught awareness, discipline, and survival, even as it quietly erased other possibilities. Rick Ross grew up unable to read, a fact that would later shock those who studied his life. Yet illiteracy did not stop him from understanding numbers, patterns, and people. In many ways, it sharpened his instincts. He listened more than he spoke. He watched carefully. He noticed what worked and what didn't. While others chased quick thrills, Ross focused on consistency. He avoided drugs himself, not out of virtue, but out of calculation. He understood that clarity of mind was an advantage in a world where mistakes were punished harshly. This is where the story begins to shift from personal struggle to something broader. Because Rick Ross was not just reacting to his environment, he was learning how to master it. And mastery, when combined with desperation and opportunity, can be a dangerous thing. The drug trade in Los Angeles was already active, already violent, already destructive. Ross did not invent it. What he did, however, was recognize inefficiencies. He saw gaps in supply, weaknesses in distribution, and markets that others had ignored. Slowly, methodically, he began to fill those gaps. There is a temptation to rush this part of the story, to jump ahead to the millions of dollars, the sprawling networks, the federal investigations. But to do so would miss the point. The true significance of FREEWAY Rick Ross lies not only in what he became, but in how easily he fit into a system that allowed him to thrive. His rise was not marked by chaos, but by order. Not by recklessness, but by planning. And that is precisely what made it so effective, and so devastating. As crack cocaine emerged and spread, it did so with frightening speed. Neighborhoods that were already struggling found themselves overwhelmed almost overnight. Addiction followed, then violence, then incarceration. Families fractured. Communities hollowed out. For many, Rick Ross's name would eventually come to symbolize this collapse. Yet for years, he remained largely invisible to the public, operating in the background, focused on logistics rather than headlines. There is something unsettling about that invisibility. While politicians debated policy and law enforcement chased street-level dealers, Ross's operation expanded quietly. Money moved. Product flowed. Lives changed forever. And still, most Americans had no idea who he was. It wasn't until much later, when journalists began pulling at loose threads, that the story grew even darker, raising questions that extended far beyond the streets of Los Angeles. Questions about foreign policy. About covert operations. About whether the flood of drugs into American cities was not merely tolerated, but indirectly enabled. These questions would never be fully answered in a way that satisfied everyone. But once they were asked, they could not be forgotten. And Rick Ross, once a ghost in the system, found himself at the center of a storm he never saw coming. Tonight, as this story begins, there is no need to rush. This is a narrative best experienced slowly, with patience, allowing each detail to settle before moving on to the next. The rise of Freeway Rick Ross is not a sudden explosion, but a steady build, like pressure accumulating beneath the surface. What comes later, the power, the paranoia, the punishment, only makes sense if we understand how quietly it all began. As the city sleeps and the highways hum in the distance, imagine South Central Los Angeles decades ago. Dim streetlights. Empty courts. Young men searching for direction in a world that offered very little. Somewhere among them was Rick Ross, not yet a legend, not yet a warning, but simply a product of his environment, walking a path that millions had walked before him. What set him apart was not destiny, but precision. And what followed would change America in ways still felt today. What happened next would not be obvious at first. It would unfold gradually, almost gently, as opportunity met preparation. And by the time the consequences became impossible to ignore, the damage was already done. South Central Los Angeles in the late 1960s and early 1970s was not the kind of place that invited long-term dreams. It was a landscape shaped by neglect, economic pressure, and quiet tension that sat heavy in the air, especially after sunset. Streets stretched wide and flat, lined with modest homes and apartment buildings that carried the weight of too many families and too few resources. Sirens were common background noise, not alarming enough to stop conversations, but constant enough to remind everyone that danger was never far away. This was the environment into which Rick Ross was born, long before the nickname, Freeway, carried any meaning. His childhood was marked less by dramatic moments and more by absence. Absence of opportunity. Absence of guidance. Absence of systems designed to lift children out of struggle. His family, like many others in the area, worked hard simply to survive. Money came and went quickly, and stability was fragile. Education, while encouraged in theory, often failed in practice. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded, and students slipped through the cracks quietly, without headlines or intervention. Rick Ross was one of those students. By the time he reached his teenage years, Ross could barely read. Words on a page felt distant and confusing, yet this limitation did not define him in the way outsiders might expect. Instead, he adapted. He listened closely. He observed patterns. He learned through repetition and memory rather than textbooks. Where formal education failed him, the streets offered their own curriculum, one rooted in awareness, timing, and survival. In South Central, young boys learned early that respect was currency. Being overlooked was dangerous, but standing out too much could be just as risky. The balance was delicate. Ross was not known as violent or impulsive. He was quiet, watchful, and patient. While others chased excitement, he paid attention to how money moved through the neighborhood. Who had it? Who didn't? And more importantly, why? There was an unspoken understanding among the youth of the area: traditional paths to success felt blocked. Jobs that paid enough to change one's life were scarce, and those that existed often seemed inaccessible. This didn't mean people lacked ambition. It meant ambition found different outlets. Hustling was not seen as rebellion, it was seen as resourcefulness. A way to take control in a world that offered little. Ross's early exposure to this mindset shaped him deeply. He watched older men navigate street economies, learning how deals were made, how disputes were handled, and how reputations were built. He noticed that the most successful individuals were not the loudest or the most feared, but the most reliable. They showed up on time. They delivered what they promised. They avoided unnecessary conflict. These lessons, absorbed quietly, would later become the foundation of his approach to crime. Despite the hardships, there were moments of normalcy. Neighborhood basketball games. Long summer evenings. Laughter shared between friends who understood each other's struggles without needing to explain them. Yet even these moments were framed by limitation. Travel outside the neighborhood was rare. Exposure to different futures was minimal. The world felt small, boxed in by economic reality and social barriers. Illiteracy, in Ross's case, was not just a personal challenge but a symbol of systemic failure. He was not unintelligent. On the contrary, he demonstrated an exceptional ability to process information quickly and strategically. But without reading skills, doors closed silently. Applications, manuals, contracts, all inaccessible. Over time, Ross internalized the idea that traditional systems were not designed for him. This belief would later justify choices he made, choices that felt logical within his lived experience. As he grew older, responsibility arrived early. Like many young men in South Central, Ross felt pressure to contribute financially. Hustling small items, running errands, finding side income, these were not criminal acts at first, but they existed in the gray space between legality and necessity. Each successful transaction reinforced a simple truth: money equaled security. And security, in a place like South Central, meant everything. The neighborhood itself was changing. Drugs were becoming more visible. Marijuana was common, and cocaine, though still relatively rare and expensive, carried an aura of power and wealth. Ross observed from a distance at first. He did not rush in. He watched who succeeded and who failed. Who survived long-term and who disappeared quickly. His caution set him apart. Family dynamics also played a role. There was love, but also strain. Arguments about money, about expectations, about futures that felt uncertain. Ross learned early not to rely too heavily on anyone. Self-sufficiency became a form of protection. Trust was limited, given carefully, and withdrawn quickly when broken. These emotional habits would later define how he structured his organization. What is striking about Ross's early life is the absence of overt criminal ambition. He did not dream of becoming a kingpin. There were no fantasies of domination or infamy. His goals were practical: stability, independence, control over his circumstances. Crime, at first, appeared simply as a means to those ends. And because the consequences were not immediate, the moral weight of those choices did not fully register. South Central Los Angeles taught Ross that systems could be navigated, bent, and sometimes exploited. Police presence was inconsistent. Enforcement focused on visible offenses, not underlying structures. Those who understood this could move quietly beneath the surface. Ross absorbed this reality without formal instruction, learning through observation rather than theory. As night fell over the neighborhood, streetlights casting long shadows on cracked sidewalks, young Rick Ross often found himself thinking not in words, but in images and numbers. How many hours of work equaled how much money? How many risks were worth taking? How much visibility was too much? These calculations became second nature, forming a mental framework that would later scale far beyond anything he could imagine at the time. By the end of his teenage years, Ross stood at a crossroads familiar to many but navigated uniquely by few. The path ahead was not clearly labeled, but the pressure to choose was unmistakable. The environment had shaped him, sharpened him, and quietly prepared him for opportunities that had not yet revealed themselves. What he did next would seem small, almost insignificant. But like many turning points in history, it would ripple outward in ways no one could fully foresee. The boy from South Central was no longer just reacting to his surroundings. He was beginning to understand them. And understanding, in a world built on imbalance, can be far more powerful than force. By the late 1970s, Rick Ross had reached a stage in life where observation alone was no longer enough. He had spent years watching how people moved, how money changed hands, and how small decisions created lasting consequences on the streets of South Central Los Angeles. The lessons were etched into his routine. He knew which corners drew police attention, which faces brought trouble, and which patterns repeated themselves night after night. What began as curiosity had slowly transformed into confidence, and confidence, when paired with opportunity, tends to push people forward. Marijuana was the natural entry point. It was familiar, widely accepted within the neighborhood, and relatively low risk compared to harder substances. Ross did not approach it with excitement or rebellion. He approached it like a test. A way to see if his instincts were correct. While others sold impulsively, Ross was deliberate. He paid attention to timing, selling when demand was highest and disappearing when the streets felt too active. He avoided crowds and favored brief, controlled interactions. Each small success confirmed that his way of thinking gave him an edge. One of the most defining aspects of this phase was his understanding of space. Ross realized early that the environment shaped outcomes. Street corners carried history, reputation, and risk. They were watched by police, rivals, and informants alike. So he began looking for neutral ground. Places where transactions could occur quietly, without the weight of expectation. The tennis courts near more affluent neighborhoods became one such place. They were open, ordinary, and overlooked. People came and went without raising suspicion. Deals were completed quickly, without lingering, and Ross blended into the background as easily as he arrived. This choice reflected something deeper than convenience. It showed Ross's ability to detach from tradition. He was not bound to the idea that drug dealing had to look a certain way. He was willing to step outside the neighborhood, to cross invisible lines that others hesitated to approach. In doing so, he reduced risk and increased profit, all without drawing attention to himself. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one. As his operation grew slightly, Ross focused on consistency rather than expansion. He did not chase new customers aggressively. Instead, he cultivated reliability. People returned because they trusted him. He was punctual. He did not overpromise. He avoided drama. In a world where unpredictability was the norm, these qualities made him stand out. Trust became his currency, and he guarded it carefully. A critical decision during this period was his refusal to use drugs. Ross watched friends and competitors lose control, miss meetings, make careless mistakes, and attract unwanted attention because of their own habits. He saw addiction not only as a personal tragedy, but as a business liability. Remaining sober allowed him to stay alert, to notice changes in the environment, and to respond quickly when conditions shifted. This discipline became one of his greatest strengths, even if it went unnoticed at the time. Money, while still modest, began to arrive with regularity. This steady income changed how Ross saw himself. He no longer felt entirely at the mercy of circumstance. He could plan ahead, save, and think beyond immediate needs. These small freedoms reinforced his belief that he was on the right path. Each successful transaction reduced the fear that once accompanied risk. Over time, that fear was replaced by calculation. Ross also became increasingly aware of how others operated. He noticed that many dealers were reactive, responding to problems only after they arose. Ross preferred anticipation. He adjusted routes, changed locations, and altered schedules preemptively. If police activity increased in one area, he simply moved elsewhere. If a customer caused tension, he cut them off quietly. His approach minimized conflict and preserved stability. Despite his growing involvement, Ross maintained emotional distance from the lifestyle. He did not romanticize it. There were no flashy displays, no need to assert dominance. His satisfaction came from efficiency, from knowing that his system worked. This mindset allowed him to avoid many of the pitfalls that trapped others. Violence, he believed, was a sign of poor planning. During this time, the broader drug landscape was beginning to shift. Cocaine was becoming more visible, and whispers of larger profits circulated through the streets. Ross listened, but did not act immediately. He observed who succeeded and who failed. Those who rushed into the cocaine trade often drew attention quickly. They spent recklessly, attracted envy, and became targets for both law enforcement and rivals. Ross noted these outcomes carefully. His inability to read and write continued to shape his methods. He avoided written records, relying instead on mental accounting. Numbers stayed in his head, organized through repetition and habit. This limitation forced him to simplify operations and reduce exposure. While others left trails without realizing it, Ross operated largely through memory and direct communication. At the time, this was simply how he survived. Later, it would prove to be an advantage. As his confidence grew, so did his sense of possibility. Marijuana had shown him that he could operate successfully outside traditional systems. The tennis courts had proven that unconventional thinking paid off. Now, he began to see the drug trade as a structure rather than a series of random interactions. Supply, demand, distribution, and risk could all be managed. The question was no longer whether he could do more, but whether he should. The neighborhood around him continued to struggle. Jobs disappeared. Tension increased. Drugs became more entrenched in daily life. Ross did not view this with detachment, but with realism. He was part of the environment, shaped by it and contributing to it simultaneously. This dual role allowed him to rationalize his choices. He was not creating demand, he told himself. He was simply meeting it. This period marked the quiet end of innocence, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. Ross had crossed a line, though it did not feel like a boundary at the time. Each step forward felt logical, justified by the last. There was no single moment of decision, no clear point of no return. Instead, there was momentum. As he stood on the edge of expansion, Ross believed he was still in control. He had avoided trouble, built a stable operation, and learned lessons that others ignored. From his perspective, the future looked manageable. He could scale carefully, apply the same discipline, and avoid unnecessary risks. What he did not yet fully understand was that growth changes everything. Larger profits bring larger attention. Broader networks introduce unpredictability. And systems that work on a small scale often behave differently when stretched. For now, though, Rick Ross remained a quiet figure, moving deliberately through a world that rewarded patience. The streets had taught him well, and he believed he was ready for whatever came next. The transition ahead would not announce itself loudly. It would arrive subtly, wrapped in opportunity, promising more of what he already had. And once he accepted it, there would be no easy way back. As Rick Ross moved deeper into the street economy, something began to separate him from nearly everyone around him. It was not aggression, reputation, or fear. It was structure. While many hustlers lived from moment to moment, reacting to whatever the day brought, Ross began to impose order on chaos. He did not see the streets as unpredictable, he saw them as misunderstood. Beneath the noise, the violence, and the randomness, there were patterns. And once those patterns were understood, they could be controlled. Ross approached dealing as a system rather than an impulse. Every decision had a purpose. He tracked money carefully, not with notebooks or ledgers, but with memory sharpened by repetition. He knew exactly how much product moved each day, how much profit remained after expenses, and where that money went. Nothing was left to chance. This internal accounting system became his anchor, allowing him to scale without losing control. Where others lost track, Ross tightened his grip. Discipline extended beyond numbers. Ross was selective about who he worked with. He avoided people who talked too much, who drank excessively, or who showed emotional volatility. Reliability mattered more than loyalty. He believed that predictable behavior was safer than passionate allegiance. Those around him were expected to follow simple rules: show up on time, do not attract attention, and never bring unnecessary drama into the operation. Anyone who failed to meet these standards was quietly removed, without confrontation. One of Ross's most important realizations was that visibility was the enemy. The more attention something attracted, the more likely it was to collapse. He avoided flashy clothing, expensive cars, and public displays of wealth. Success, in his mind, was meant to be quiet. Money was to be reinvested or hidden, not showcased. This restraint frustrated some around him, but it also protected him. While others drew eyes and suspicion, Ross remained largely invisible. His refusal to use drugs continued to shape his leadership style. Clarity of mind allowed him to think several steps ahead, anticipating problems before they emerged. He noticed shifts in police patrol patterns, changes in neighborhood behavior, and subtle signs of tension among associates. When something felt off, he acted quickly, adjusting routes, schedules, or contacts. This constant recalibration kept his operation stable even as conditions changed. Ross also understood the importance of routine. Predictability, when managed carefully, reduced stress and mistakes. He established consistent times for transactions, limited the number of people involved in each step, and avoided unnecessary movement. The operation functioned smoothly because everyone knew their role. There was no confusion, no improvisation. In a world where chaos was common, this level of organization was rare. As profits increased, Ross resisted the temptation to expand recklessly. He believed growth should be controlled, not rushed. Each expansion was tested on a small scale before being adopted more broadly. This methodical approach minimized losses and revealed weaknesses early. When something didn't work, he adjusted without emotional attachment. Efficiency mattered more than ego. Despite his growing influence, Ross maintained a low profile within the neighborhood. He did not seek recognition or status. He understood that power, when visible, invites challenge. By remaining unassuming, he reduced the likelihood of rival attention. People knew him, but he was not a public figure. This anonymity allowed him to move freely, blending into the background even as his operation expanded. Illiteracy continued to shape Ross's methods in unexpected ways. Without written communication, everything depended on trust and memory. This forced him to simplify his system, reducing complexity and exposure. Instructions were clear, concise, and repeated until understood. There were no written records to be discovered, no paper trails to follow. While this limitation stemmed from necessity, it also provided a layer of protection. Ross's ability to separate emotion from decision-making became another defining trait. He did not take things personally. Losses were analyzed, not mourned. Conflicts were resolved through avoidance rather than confrontation. He believed that survival depended on flexibility, not pride. This mindset allowed him to adapt quickly, avoiding the traps that ensnared more emotionally driven individuals. As his system solidified, Ross began to see himself less as a participant and more as a coordinator. He was no longer just selling drugs, he was managing flows of product, money, and information. This shift in perspective changed how he approached risk. He understood that the greatest threats were not obvious ones, but subtle disruptions. A careless associate. A predictable routine. A sudden change in behavior. These were the things he watched for most closely. The environment around him continued to deteriorate. Violence increased. Addiction spread. Law enforcement pressure grew heavier. Ross observed all of this with a detached focus. He did not deny the damage, but he compartmentalized it. His role, as he saw it, was to operate efficiently within the system as it existed. Moral reflection was postponed, pushed aside by the demands of daily operation. This period marked the transformation of Rick Ross from a hustler into an organizer. His methods were no longer improvisational, they were deliberate. Each element of his operation reinforced the others, creating a self-sustaining structure. This structure allowed him to grow without losing control, a balance few achieved. Yet beneath this order lay an unspoken vulnerability. Systems, no matter how well designed, depend on human behavior. And human behavior is unpredictable. Ross understood this intellectually, but experience had not yet tested the limits of his control. For now, discipline seemed sufficient. Order appeared permanent. As night fell over South Central, Ross continued to move quietly through his routines, confident in the stability he had created. He believed that as long as he remained disciplined, avoided excess, and stayed invisible, he could outpace both rivals and law enforcement indefinitely. The streets had taught him that chaos punished the careless, and he was anything but careless. What he did not yet see was how scale changes everything. The same discipline that protected him now would be tested under far greater pressure. Larger profits would attract larger threats. More moving parts would introduce more points of failure. The system he built was strong, but it was not invincible. For the moment, however, Rick Ross stood firmly in control of his world. He had imposed order where there was none, and it worked. The question that lingered quietly, unanswered, was how long that order could survive as his ambitions continued to grow. The transition did not happen all at once. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden leap from one world into another. Instead, it unfolded gradually, carried by quiet conversations, careful observation, and a growing awareness that the limits of the current operation were becoming clearer by the day. Marijuana had provided Rick Ross with stability and confidence, but it also revealed its ceiling. The margins were thin, the competition constant, and the potential for growth constrained. Ross began to sense that if he wanted to move forward, truly forward, he would have to step into a different realm altogether. Cocaine had always existed on the periphery of his awareness. It was spoken about in lowered voices, associated with larger sums of money and far greater risk. Unlike marijuana, cocaine carried an aura of seriousness. Those involved in it tended to operate with more secrecy, more paranoia. Ross watched these individuals carefully. He noted how quickly some rose, and how abruptly others disappeared. Cocaine was not forgiving. Mistakes were costly, often irreversible. What drew Ross toward it was not glamour, but efficiency. The profit margins were undeniable. A small quantity could generate returns that marijuana never could. For someone who valued control and optimization, this was compelling. Yet Ross was cautious. He understood that entering the cocaine trade meant entering a different ecosystem, one with harsher consequences and less room for error. The first connections came quietly, through acquaintances rather than close associates. Ross listened more than he spoke. He asked few questions, but remembered everything he heard. He learned about pricing, supply chains, and the importance of discretion. Cocaine was not something one stumbled into casually. Trust mattered, and trust took time. When Ross finally decided to test the waters, he did so carefully. He did not abandon his existing operation. Instead, he layered cocaine distribution on top of it, keeping volume small and exposure limited. This allowed him to assess the risks without committing fully. Early transactions confirmed what he had suspected: the profits were significant, but so was the pressure. Every deal carried a weight that marijuana never had. Ross responded by tightening his discipline even further. He reduced the number of people involved, limiting access to information and product. He controlled communication carefully, avoiding unnecessary contact. Each transaction was planned, executed, and concluded with precision. There was no room for improvisation. Cocaine demanded respect, and Ross approached it accordingly. Emotionally, this shift marked a turning point. The stakes were now undeniably higher. Ross felt it in his body, a constant low-level tension that never fully disappeared. Sleep became lighter. Awareness sharper. He scanned rooms instinctively, noticed small changes in tone and behavior. This heightened vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. Cocaine was not just a business, it was a commitment to a more dangerous path. Despite the pressure, Ross remained methodical. He analyzed every outcome, adjusting his approach as needed. When something felt too risky, he stepped back. When a connection proved unreliable, he severed it quietly. His ability to detach emotionally from decisions allowed him to survive this transition. Others became reckless under pressure. Ross became more controlled. The neighborhoods around him began to change as well. Cocaine introduced a new dynamic, one that altered relationships and intensified competition. Money flowed faster, but so did violence. Ross observed this shift with a mixture of caution and pragmatism. He did not seek conflict, but he understood that the environment was becoming less forgiving. One of the most significant challenges was maintaining invisibility. Cocaine attracted attention in ways marijuana did not. Buyers were more anxious. Sellers were more guarded. Law enforcement scrutiny was heavier. Ross responded by refining his operational methods. He changed locations frequently, avoided predictable routines, and minimized exposure time. Every movement was calculated. His refusal to use drugs continued to serve him well. While others succumbed to the pressures of the trade, losing focus and judgment, Ross remained clear-headed. This clarity allowed him to see opportunities others missed. It also reinforced his belief that discipline was his greatest asset. As profits increased, Ross faced new temptations. There were opportunities to expand rapidly, to scale up distribution and maximize earnings. He resisted these urges initially, preferring to test each expansion incrementally. This patience frustrated some associates, but it protected him. He understood that growth without control was a liability. Cocaine also introduced Ross to a broader network of individuals, many of whom operated outside his familiar environment. These connections brought new perspectives and new risks. Trust became more complicated. Ross relied on behavior rather than words, judging reliability through consistency and discretion. Anyone who talked too much or displayed erratic behavior was quickly excluded. Internally, Ross began to rationalize his deepening involvement. He framed his actions as business decisions, separate from their broader impact. This compartmentalization allowed him to function without being overwhelmed by the consequences. He focused on what he could control: his operation, his discipline, his survival. Yet beneath this rationalization, there was an unspoken awareness that he had crossed into a different world. Cocaine was not just another product, it was a force that reshaped everything it touched. Ross sensed this, even if he did not dwell on it. The weight of responsibility grew heavier, but so did the rewards. As time passed, Ross's confidence in handling cocaine increased. His systems held. His discipline proved effective. What began as a cautious experiment became a core component of his operation. The transition was complete, even if it never felt fully acknowledged. Standing at this new level, Ross believed he had mastered the balance between risk and reward. He had entered a deadlier world and survived. The lessons he learned during this phase would shape everything that followed. But with each step upward, the ground beneath him grew less stable. What Ross could not yet see was how this decision would ripple outward, far beyond his own life. Cocaine was only the beginning. The next evolution would change not just his operation, but entire communities. For now, though, he moved forward with the same quiet confidence that had carried him this far, unaware that the most consequential chapter of his story was still ahead. The shift came quietly, almost deceptively so. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a change in form, a small adjustment made for convenience and profit. But in reality, it marked the beginning of something far more profound, something that would alter neighborhoods, families, and the rhythm of entire cities. Crack cocaine did not arrive with fanfare. It slipped into the streets subtly, carried by word of mouth and economic pressure, and once it took hold, it spread with astonishing speed. Rick Ross became aware of crack not through theory, but through observation. He noticed how quickly it moved compared to powder cocaine. Smaller quantities, faster turnover, and a broader customer base. People who could never afford cocaine suddenly found themselves able to buy something that delivered a similar, though shorter-lived, effect. From a purely operational standpoint, it was efficient. From a human perspective, it was devastating. But at the moment of its emergence, the long-term consequences were not yet fully visible. Crack changed the structure of demand overnight. Where powder cocaine had catered to a relatively limited clientele, crack reached deep into communities already under strain. Transactions multiplied. Profits accelerated. The pace of the streets quickened. Ross recognized this shift almost immediately. His instincts told him that this was not just a new product, but a transformation of the market itself. As always, he approached it cautiously. He did not rush to flood the streets. Instead, he tested small batches, monitoring how quickly they sold and how customers behaved. The results were undeniable. Crack moved faster than anything he had ever seen. Money came back almost instantly, allowing rapid reinvestment. The cycle tightened, spinning faster with each turn. This speed required adjustments. Ross refined his distribution methods to handle the increased volume without increasing visibility. He divided product into smaller units, delegated carefully, and enforced strict routines. Timing became critical. Product moved in and out quickly, reducing the risk of large seizures. The operation became leaner, more efficient, and more demanding. Emotionally, Ross maintained distance. He did not dwell on the impact crack was having on individuals or families. To do so would have made functioning difficult. Instead, he focused on mechanics, supply, distribution, and risk management. This compartmentalization allowed him to operate within a reality that was becoming increasingly grim. The neighborhoods felt the change almost immediately. Where drug use had once been intermittent, it became constant. Addiction tightened its grip, pulling people into cycles that were difficult to escape. Violence increased as competition intensified and desperation grew. Ross observed these developments with a mix of awareness and detachment. He understood that the environment was changing, but he believed his role was to navigate it, not to shape it. Crack also altered the relationship between dealers and users. Transactions became more frequent, more urgent. Customers returned repeatedly, sometimes within hours. This created both opportunity and instability. Ross responded by tightening control, limiting interactions, and enforcing boundaries. He did not allow emotional entanglements. Business remained business. Law enforcement attention intensified as crack spread. Patrols increased. Arrests became more common. Ross adjusted accordingly. He reduced exposure time, changed locations frequently, and avoided patterns. His operation adapted quickly, staying one step ahead through constant recalibration. Discipline, once again, proved essential. As crack distribution expanded, Ross began to see the scale of what he was building. Profits reached levels that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. The money moved quickly, almost abstractly. It was no longer tied to individual transactions, but to systems that functioned continuously. This scale reinforced his sense of control, even as it increased his vulnerability. The moral weight of this phase was heavier, though largely unspoken. Ross was aware, on some level, that crack was different. The damage it caused was more immediate, more visible. Yet acknowledging this fully would have required confronting his own role in that damage. Instead, he focused on structure, believing that efficiency and discipline justified his actions. Externally, his name began to circulate more widely, though often indirectly. People spoke of a reliable supply, of consistency, of product that never seemed to run out. Ross himself remained in the background, insulated by layers of separation. This anonymity allowed the operation to grow without centering attention on him personally. Crack also reshaped internal dynamics. Associates faced increased pressure, dealing with higher volumes and more volatile customers. Ross responded by enforcing stricter rules, emphasizing professionalism over emotion. Mistakes were not tolerated. Anyone who attracted unnecessary attention was removed. The operation demanded constant focus. As the market exploded, Ross faced a pivotal choice: limit expansion to maintain control, or scale up to meet demand. The pressure to expand was immense. Demand was insatiable. Supply channels were available. After careful consideration, Ross chose to grow, believing his systems could handle it. This decision marked a turning point, transforming his operation from a regional enterprise into something far larger. With expansion came complexity. More product. More money. More risk. Ross managed this by further compartmentalizing operations, ensuring no single individual had complete visibility. This fragmentation reduced vulnerability, but also increased dependence on the system itself. The operation became an entity, functioning almost independently. The crack epidemic, though not yet labeled as such, was taking shape. Communities changed rapidly. Streets once familiar became unpredictable. Families felt the strain. Ross was both witness to and participant in this transformation. His role, while central, remained largely invisible. At night, when the city quieted, Ross sometimes sensed the magnitude of what was unfolding. The pace, the volume, the constant motion. Yet these moments were fleeting. The demands of the operation left little room for reflection. Survival required focus, not contemplation. What began as a business decision had evolved into a force with consequences far beyond its origin. Crack was no longer just a product, it was a catalyst. Ross stood at the center of a system that was reshaping America's urban landscape, even if he did not fully grasp its reach. As the cycle accelerated, one truth became clear: there was no turning back. The market had been unleashed, and it would not slow down on its own. Ross moved forward, applying the same discipline that had carried him this far, unaware that the peak of his power was approaching, and that the shadows gathering around him were growing longer with each passing day. By the early 1980s, the operation had taken on a life of its own. What once required careful supervision now moved almost automatically, guided by routines that Rick Ross had refined again and again. Los Angeles became the center of something vast and constantly moving, a city connected by invisible lines of supply and demand that pulsed day and night. The freeways that cut through the city, carrying commuters and cargo, seemed to mirror the flow of product and money that now defined Ross's world. It was during this period that his nickname began to circulate more widely, whispered rather than announced, attached not to a man's face but to a system that never seemed to stop. Crack cocaine flooded neighborhoods with startling speed. Blocks that had once been quiet after dark now stayed awake, illuminated by porch lights and street lamps that never seemed to rest. Customers came in waves, each one urgent, restless, and desperate for relief that never lasted long enough. Ross watched this expansion with the detached focus of someone monitoring a complex machine. Demand was no longer something to be stimulated, it was constant and overwhelming. The challenge now was not selling the product, but managing its movement without collapse. To handle this scale, Ross refined his structure even further. Distribution was broken into layers, each isolated from the others. Street-level sellers knew little beyond their immediate tasks. Mid-level distributors handled logistics without access to supply sources. Communication was limited, direct, and purposeful. Information flowed upward, orders flowed downward, and very little crossed laterally. This compartmentalization reduced risk and reinforced control. If one part failed, the rest could continue. Money arrived in amounts that felt almost unreal. Profits reached into the millions, sometimes in a single day. Cash accumulated faster than it could be spent or even counted comfortably. Ross responded by diversifying where and how money was stored, spreading it across locations and using trusted intermediaries. He avoided banks whenever possible, understanding that paper trails invited scrutiny. Wealth became something to manage quietly, not display. Despite the scale of his operation, Ross remained personally restrained. He did not surround himself with luxury or indulge in excess. His lifestyle changed little on the surface. This choice was deliberate. He believed that visible success invited questions, and questions led to problems. While others flaunted wealth and drew attention, Ross stayed disciplined, blending into the background of a city that rarely noticed those who did not announce themselves. The city itself seemed to bend around the operation. Entire neighborhoods became dependent on the economy crack created. Some saw it as opportunity, others as a curse. Ross did not frame it in moral terms. He saw it as reality. Demand existed. Supply met it. The system moved forward. This perspective allowed him to function without being paralyzed by the consequences unfolding around him. Violence, however, became harder to ignore. Competition intensified as others sought a share of the market. Disputes erupted over territory, supply, and loyalty. Ross avoided direct involvement whenever possible, delegating conflict resolution or relocating operations to cooler areas. He understood that violence attracted attention, and attention threatened everything he had built. Still, the environment grew more volatile with each passing month. Law enforcement pressure increased as well. Police patrols became more frequent. Federal agencies began paying closer attention to patterns that suggested a centralized supply. Ross responded by adjusting routes, changing locations, and shortening transaction windows. He treated law enforcement as another variable to manage, not an enemy to confront. The goal was always to stay ahead, not to dominate. As the operation expanded, Ross found himself increasingly isolated. Trust narrowed. The circle of people who truly understood the scale of what he controlled became smaller. This isolation was both protective and burdensome. Decisions rested heavily on him, and mistakes carried enormous consequences. Sleep became lighter. Awareness sharper. The mental load was constant. Yet there was also a sense of mastery. Ross had built something unprecedented in its efficiency and reach. Los Angeles was saturated with product, and still demand outpaced supply. The system worked because it was disciplined, adaptable, and relentlessly focused. From a purely operational standpoint, it was a success beyond measure. Externally, rumors began to circulate. People spoke of an endless supply, of a source that never dried up. Ross's name surfaced more frequently, though often without clarity. He remained a shadow, known more for the effect he produced than for who he was. This anonymity both protected him and fed speculation. At times, Ross reflected on how far he had come. From small transactions on tennis courts to controlling a vast network that reached across the city. The progression felt logical when traced step by step, yet astonishing when viewed as a whole. Each decision had built upon the last, creating momentum that now seemed unstoppable. The crack epidemic was no longer an abstract concept, it was visible in the streets, in the faces of users, in the tension that hung over neighborhoods. Ross was acutely aware of this, even if he did not allow himself to dwell on it. Acknowledging the full impact would have required confronting questions he was not prepared to answer. Instead, he focused on maintaining order within his sphere of control. As night fell and the city settled into its uneasy rhythm, Ross continued to oversee the flow, adjusting and recalibrating as needed. He believed that as long as discipline held, the operation would endure. The system was strong, resilient, and deeply embedded. But scale has a way of attracting forces beyond one person's control. The larger the empire grew, the more eyes it drew, even if those eyes were patient and unseen. Ross stood at the height of his power, commanding an operation that flooded Los Angeles with crack cocaine, reshaping the city in ways that would echo for decades. For now, the machine ran smoothly. Money flowed. Product moved. Control held. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building. The very success that defined this period was laying the groundwork for what would come next. And though Ross could sense the weight of that pressure, he could not yet see where the cracks would form, or how quickly the ground beneath him would begin to shift. The momentum did not slow once Los Angeles was saturated. In many ways, it only accelerated. What Rick Ross had built in one city began to reveal a broader possibility, one that extended beyond familiar streets and neighborhoods. Demand was no longer confined to local boundaries. Word traveled quickly, carried by people moving between cities, by whispered comparisons of price and purity, by the quiet understanding that somewhere in Los Angeles there was a source that never seemed to run dry. Ross did not chase this reputation, but he did not ignore it either. He listened carefully as the world around him expanded. The first signs of national reach came indirectly. Dealers from other cities began reaching out through intermediaries, asking questions rather than making requests. They wanted to know how supply remained so consistent, how prices stayed stable despite growing demand. Ross responded with caution. Expansion beyond California meant exposure to unfamiliar territories, new law enforcement agencies, and cultural dynamics he did not fully control. Yet the opportunity was undeniable. The infrastructure he had built was strong. The question was whether it could stretch without breaking. Ross approached this phase the same way he approached everything else, slowly, deliberately, and with an eye toward minimizing risk. He did not suddenly open routes to multiple cities. Instead, he tested a single extension, then another. Product moved quietly to nearby regions, often piggybacking on existing travel patterns. No new routines were created if old ones could be adapted. The goal was to make expansion feel invisible, even inevitable. What emerged was not chaos, but coordination. Ross's operation began to resemble a supply chain rather than a street network. Product moved from source to city, from city to distributor, from distributor to street-level sellers, each layer insulated from the others. This separation protected the core of the operation. If a shipment was intercepted or a distributor arrested, the damage was contained. The system absorbed losses and continued moving. With expansion came a shift in perspective. Ross no longer thought in terms of blocks or neighborhoods, but in regions and routes. Geography became a strategic consideration. Which cities had high demand and limited supply? Which routes attracted less attention? Which areas had fragmented competition that could be navigated quietly? This broader view reinforced his sense of control, even as it increased complexity. Money followed this expansion, flowing back toward Los Angeles in steady streams. The amounts were staggering, yet Ross remained cautious. He understood that wealth, if mishandled, could become a liability. He diversified storage, relied on trusted intermediaries, and avoided patterns that could be traced. Cash moved constantly, rarely staying in one place long enough to be discovered. The system was designed to remain fluid. As the operation spread, Ross became increasingly aware of how little many of his partners understood the full picture. This ignorance was intentional. He believed that information was the greatest risk. Those who knew less could betray less. Trust was distributed carefully, in small increments, based on behavior rather than promises. Loyalty, in Ross's view, was proven through consistency, not words. The emotional distance Ross maintained grew wider during this period. Expansion meant dealing with people he would never meet, cities he would never visit, and consequences he would never witness directly. This distance made it easier to focus on logistics rather than impact. Numbers replaced faces. Routes replaced stories. The operation became abstract, a series of flows and balances that required constant adjustment. Yet signs of strain began to appear at the edges. New cities brought new problems. Local dynamics differed. Law enforcement tactics varied. What worked in Los Angeles did not always translate perfectly elsewhere. Ross responded by refining his approach, learning quickly, and adjusting expectations. He accepted that not every expansion would succeed. Failure, when contained, was simply another data point. Internally, the pressure increased. More moving parts meant more opportunities for mistakes. Ross found himself thinking constantly, anticipating problems before they surfaced. Sleep grew more fragmented. Awareness became second nature. The mental burden was heavy, but Ross believed it was the price of control. Letting go, even partially, felt more dangerous than carrying the weight himself. As his reach expanded, whispers began to circulate beyond street-level conversations. Law enforcement agencies started comparing notes, noticing similarities in supply patterns across cities. These observations were slow to crystallize, but they marked the beginning of a shift. Ross sensed this indirectly, through changes in behavior, through the tightening of routines, through an instinct honed by years of observation. Still, the system held. Demand continued to outpace supply. Profits remained high. The operation adapted to each challenge, reinforcing Ross's belief that discipline and structure could overcome almost anything. He had built something resilient, something that functioned even under pressure. The national spread of crack cocaine was not something Ross articulated openly, but he felt its magnitude. Cities he had never seen were being reshaped by the same forces that had transformed Los Angeles. This realization surfaced occasionally, usually late at night, before being pushed aside by immediate concerns. Reflection was a luxury. Survival required focus. What had begun as a local hustle had become part of a national phenomenon. Ross stood at the center of a network that stretched across state lines, connecting disparate communities through a shared dependency. His role, while central, remained largely invisible. He was known through effect rather than presence, through consistency rather than image. As expansion continued, Ross believed he had found a balance between growth and control. The system was larger than ever, yet still disciplined. Each route, each distributor, each city added another layer of insulation around the core. From his perspective, the operation was not spiraling outward, it was stabilizing. But expansion carries its own gravity. The farther the reach, the harder it becomes to remain unseen. Ross could feel this, even if he could not yet measure it. The machine he had built was powerful, efficient, and deeply embedded. It had crossed a threshold from which retreat was no longer possible. For now, the national supply chain moved quietly, connecting cities through invisible pathways. Money flowed back. Product flowed out. Control held. Rick Ross remained at the center, calm and calculating, guiding an operation that had grown far beyond anything he once imagined. And with each mile added to its reach, the story moved closer to a reckoning that would test whether discipline alone could hold back the weight of what he had created. The deeper Rick Ross's operation extended, the more distant the source of his supply began to feel. At street level, product appeared almost as if it emerged from nowhere, steady and uninterrupted. Even among mid-level distributors, the origin was rarely questioned. Consistency bred complacency. As long as the flow continued, few felt the need to look upstream. Ross himself had learned long ago that asking too many questions could be dangerous. Yet over time, the figure at the other end of the supply chain became impossible to ignore. Danilo Blandon entered Ross's world quietly, without ceremony. He did not resemble the street figures Ross was accustomed to dealing with. Blandon was calm, methodical, and businesslike, operating with a confidence that suggested deep connections. Their relationship was transactional, built on reliability rather than trust. Blandon delivered large quantities of cocaine at prices that made expansion not only possible, but inevitable. For Ross, the arrangement solved a critical problem. Supply, once a limiting factor, became abundant. At first, Ross viewed Blandon simply as a supplier, one link in a long chain. He did not dwell on where the product originated, only that it arrived consistently and at scale. This pragmatic focus had served him well throughout his rise. He believed that distance from the source reduced risk. The less he knew, the less he could reveal if pressured. Ignorance, in this context, felt like protection. Yet rumors circulated quietly. Whispers that Blandon's connections extended beyond typical trafficking networks. That the cocaine flowed from Nicaragua, tied to groups involved in political conflict rather than street crime. Ross heard these stories but treated them as background noise. Street culture was full of exaggeration and myth. He focused on what he could verify: product quality, delivery schedules, and payment terms. Those factors remained stable. As time passed, however, the scale of the supply raised questions that were harder to dismiss. Cocaine arrived in quantities that seemed immune to disruption. While other networks struggled with shortages or price fluctuations, Ross's operation remained unaffected. Law enforcement crackdowns elsewhere did not slow the flow. This resilience was unusual. Ross noticed it, even if he did not fully understand it. The political context of the era added another layer of complexity. The United States was deeply involved in Central America, funding efforts to counter leftist movements in countries like Nicaragua. These geopolitical realities were distant from south-central Los Angeles, yet somehow connected through unseen channels. Ross did not engage with politics, but politics, it seemed, had found its way into his supply chain. It was only later, after journalists began investigating the broader crack epidemic, that the name Danilo Blandon gained public attention. Allegations emerged suggesting that Blandon and others had ties to Nicaraguan Contra groups, and that proceeds from cocaine sales helped fund their activities. More controversially, it was suggested that U.S. intelligence agencies were aware of, and possibly tolerated, these operations as part of a larger strategy. For Ross, these revelations came long after the fact. At the time, he was focused on maintaining control amid rapid expansion. The idea that his operation might be connected, however indirectly, to global politics was almost surreal. He had never seen himself as a pawn in a larger game. His decisions were grounded in immediate realities, not ideological battles. When the allegations became public, they sparked outrage and disbelief. Communities devastated by crack addiction demanded answers. How could such a destructive substance flood American cities with so little interference? The suggestion that government agencies might have looked the other way shook public trust. For many, Rick Ross became a symbol not just of street-level crime, but of institutional failure. Ross's own perspective was more limited. He acknowledged that Blandon was his supplier and that the cocaine originated from Central America. Beyond that, he denied knowledge of political involvement. He maintained that he was a businessman responding to demand, not a participant in covert operations. Whether this claim reflected truth, willful ignorance, or something in between remains a matter of debate. What is clear is that the relationship with Blandon transformed Ross's operation. It allowed him to scale beyond what would have been possible otherwise. Supply constraints vanished. Prices remained favorable. Expansion accelerated. This dependence, however, introduced a vulnerability Ross could not fully control. His empire rested on a foundation he did not understand. As journalists like Gary Webb began pulling at these threads, the narrative surrounding crack cocaine shifted dramatically. The story was no longer just about crime and addiction, but about power, secrecy, and accountability. Ross found himself at the center of a controversy that extended far beyond his own actions. He was no longer just a dealer, he was evidence. The weight of this realization settled slowly. Ross began to understand that his invisibility had limits. The larger forces connected to his supply chain would eventually attract scrutiny. When they did, the fallout would be unpredictable. He had built his empire on discipline and control, but this was something different. This was a realm where decisions were made far above his level, by people he would never meet. The contrast was stark. Ross operated in alleys and apartments, dealing in cash and face-to-face exchanges. His suppliers navigated international borders, political alliances, and covert funding streams. The two worlds intersected briefly, transactionally, without shared understanding. Ross benefited from this intersection, but he did not direct it. As the allegations gained traction, Ross's story took on a new dimension. He was no longer viewed solely through the lens of crime, but as part of a broader system that had failed entire communities. This reframing altered how history would remember him. The damage attributed to his operation now carried implications beyond personal responsibility. For Ross, the connection to Blandon and the CIA allegations represented an unsettling truth: his success had been enabled by forces beyond his control. The same supply chain that fueled his rise also tied him to a narrative he could neither escape nor fully explain. Whether or not he understood the full scope at the time mattered less than the impact that followed. In the quiet moments, Ross reflected on how little he truly knew about the machinery behind his empire. He had mastered the visible layers, but the deeper currents remained hidden. This realization did not bring relief or clarity. Instead, it added another layer of uncertainty to a life already defined by risk. The shadow supplier, once a source of strength, became a symbol of vulnerability. The questions raised by that relationship would echo long after Ross's operation collapsed, shaping public discourse and fueling debates that continue to this day. In the end, the mystery of how crack flooded America could not be confined to one man. It was a story of intersections, between street economies and global politics, between survival and strategy, between visibility and denial. And Rick Ross, whether he intended it or not, stood at the center of that intersection, a figure whose rise illuminated not only the mechanics of crime, but the uncomfortable truths about how easily unseen forces can shape the lives of millions. At the height of his power, Rick Ross found himself surrounded by abundance yet increasingly alone. The money arrived in volumes so large that it began to lose its meaning, reduced to stacks and counts rather than possibility or freedom. Wealth, once a solution, became another responsibility to manage, another variable that demanded caution. Ross had achieved what many around him chased recklessly, but the reality of having it brought an unexpected weight. Control had always been his guiding principle. It shaped how he sold, how he expanded, and how he survived. Now, that same need for control extended into every corner of his life. He trusted fewer people. Conversations became shorter, more functional. Relationships that once felt casual grew tense under the pressure of secrecy. Even moments of rest carried an edge, as if calm itself could not be trusted. Ross understood that power attracts attention, even when it is hidden. The larger his operation grew, the more vigilant he became. He avoided routines outside of business, limited social interactions, and moved constantly. Home was less a place of comfort and more a temporary shelter. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the awareness that one mistake could unravel everything. The isolation was not dramatic or sudden. It crept in slowly, replacing familiarity with distance. Friends from earlier years drifted away, unable to relate to the life Ross now lived or excluded by necessity. New associates were evaluated constantly, measured by behavior rather than words. Trust became conditional, granted in narrow doses and withdrawn at the slightest sign of risk. Paranoia, though rarely acknowledged aloud, became a constant companion. Ross scanned environments instinctively, noting exits, unfamiliar faces, changes in tone. He listened for what was not said as much as what was. This vigilance kept him alive, but it also narrowed his world. There was little room for relaxation, little space where his mind could rest. The money itself demanded attention. Storing it, moving it, protecting it, all required planning. Ross avoided banks, knowing that traditional financial systems were not designed for people like him. Cash was divided, hidden, and rotated. He relied on trusted intermediaries, but even trust had limits. Each layer of separation reduced risk, but also increased complexity. Despite this, Ross maintained discipline in his personal habits. He did not indulge in excess or display wealth publicly. He believed that restraint was protection. Expensive cars and jewelry might signal success, but they also invited scrutiny. By living modestly, Ross hoped to remain invisible, even as his influence spread quietly across cities. Emotionally, Ross began to compartmentalize more deeply. The consequences of his operation were visible everywhere: addiction, violence, families breaking under strain. Yet acknowledging these realities fully would have made functioning impossible. So he separated cause from effect, focusing on logistics rather than outcomes. This detachment was not cruelty, it was survival. Still, moments of reflection surfaced, usually late at night, when the noise of the day subsided. Ross would think about the path that led him here, about how incremental decisions had built into something immense. The simplicity of his early hustle felt distant, almost unreal. Back then, risks were small and manageable. Now, everything felt magnified. Power also brought a new kind of vulnerability. The more Ross controlled, the more there was to lose. Each associate represented a potential weakness. Each route, a possible breach. He understood that no system, no matter how disciplined, was immune to failure. This awareness fueled his vigilance but also deepened his isolation. Interactions with others grew increasingly transactional. Conversations revolved around operations, schedules, and contingencies. Personal topics were avoided. Ross kept his emotions guarded, believing that vulnerability invited exploitation. This self-imposed distance protected him, but it also cut him off from meaningful connection. The sense of being watched, whether real or imagined, intensified. Ross assumed that law enforcement was always one step behind, learning slowly, patiently. He adjusted routines constantly, avoiding predictability. What once felt like mastery now felt like maintenance, a constant effort to keep the system from collapsing under its own weight. Despite the pressure, Ross did not see himself as trapped. He believed that control equaled freedom, even if that freedom was constrained. He could make decisions. He could adapt. He could survive. These beliefs had carried him this far, and he trusted they would continue to do so. Yet beneath this confidence lay fatigue. The mental strain of constant vigilance wore him down. Joy, when it appeared, was fleeting. Achievements felt hollow, immediately replaced by the next concern. Success no longer brought satisfaction, only responsibility. Ross began to recognize a subtle shift within himself. The thrill of growth had faded, replaced by a focus on preservation. He was no longer building something new, he was defending what existed. This change marked the beginning of a new phase, one defined less by ambition and more by endurance. The contrast between power and isolation became increasingly stark. Ross commanded an operation that spanned cities and generated enormous wealth, yet his personal world had narrowed to a series of calculated interactions. He had achieved control over systems, but at the cost of simplicity and connection. As time passed, Ross sensed that the balance he maintained was fragile. The forces aligned against him were growing more organized, more patient. He could feel the weight of their attention, even if he could not see it directly. This awareness did not lead to panic, but it deepened his caution. In the quiet hours, Ross sometimes wondered how long this could last. Discipline had carried him through every previous challenge, but the scale of what he controlled now introduced uncertainties he could not fully manage. The system was strong, but it depended on perfection. And perfection, he knew, was unsustainable. For now, he remained in control, navigating the narrow space between power and paranoia. The empire he had built stood tall, efficient and resilient. Yet the very qualities that defined its success, scale, reach, influence, were also drawing it toward a reckoning. Rick Ross had reached the peak of his ascent. From here, there was nowhere higher to climb. All that remained was to hold on, to maintain balance in a world that rewarded neither hesitation nor complacency. And as the pressure continued to mount, the question that lingered quietly was not whether the fall would come, but when. Long before Rick Ross ever sensed a direct threat, the machinery of law enforcement had already begun to turn. It did not move quickly, and it did not move loudly. Unlike street conflicts or sudden betrayals, this pressure built slowly, almost invisibly, guided by patience rather than force. Federal investigations are rarely dramatic at first. They begin with patterns, with quiet questions asked in offices far removed from the streets where the damage is most visible. And by the time the target becomes aware, the picture is often already taking shape. At the local level, police officers were encountering the same problem again and again. Arrests were made, drugs were seized, dealers were taken off the streets, yet supply never seemed to diminish. Prices remained stable. Purity stayed consistent. The flow continued uninterrupted. This consistency was unusual. Street-level enforcement typically created disruption, even if only temporary. In this case, disruption was absorbed effortlessly. That alone raised suspicion. Investigators began comparing notes. Separate cases, once thought unrelated, shared similarities. The same quantities. The same packaging styles. The same distribution rhythms. Slowly, a pattern emerged, suggesting a centralized source rather than fragmented operations. This realization marked a shift in focus. Attention moved away from individual dealers and toward the structure supporting them. Federal agencies became involved not because of a single incident, but because of scale. Crack cocaine was no longer a localized problem. It was spreading across neighborhoods, cities, and states, leaving behind visible devastation. Hospitals reported rising addiction rates. Violence escalated. Communities demanded answers. Political pressure followed. In response, law enforcement resources were consolidated, and long-term investigations were authorized. Unlike the reactive policing Ross was accustomed to, federal investigations were methodical. Agents observed without intervening, allowing operations to continue while information accumulated. Surveillance replaced arrests. Wiretaps were requested. Informants were cultivated quietly, often among individuals already facing charges who saw cooperation as their only option. Each piece of information was verified, cross-checked, and added to a growing file. Ross did not immediately notice this shift. His operation was designed to absorb losses and adapt quickly. Arrests happened occasionally, as they always had. Product seizures occurred, but supply adjusted. From his perspective, the system was working as intended. What he did not see were the connections being drawn behind the scenes. Investigators focused on money as much as drugs. Cash flows left traces, even when handled carefully. Large sums moved in patterns that, over time, became visible. While Ross avoided banks, those around him did not always exercise the same discipline. A careless deposit here, a suspicious purchase there. Individually insignificant, collectively revealing. Surveillance extended beyond financial activity. Agents observed routines, movements, and associations. They documented who met whom, how often, and under what circumstances. This information was not used immediately. It was stored, layered, and analyzed. The goal was not disruption, but understanding. As informants entered the picture, the investigation deepened. Some were street-level dealers, caught with small amounts and offered leniency in exchange for cooperation. Others were higher up, motivated by fear or resentment. Each informant provided fragments, names, nicknames, habits. These fragments, once assembled, began to outline a network. Ross's emphasis on compartmentalization slowed this process, but it did not stop it. The very structure that protected him also created identifiable patterns. Layers repeated themselves. Routes followed logic. Efficiency left fingerprints. Over time, investigators learned to read the system the way Ross had built it. The use of wiretaps marked a critical escalation. These were not granted lightly. Requests required justification, evidence, and oversight. When they were approved, it meant investigators believed they were closing in on something significant. Conversations were recorded quietly, often without immediate consequence. Agents listened not for confessions, but for context. Who gave orders? Who followed them? How information moved? Ross, cautious as he was, relied heavily on face-to-face communication and verbal instructions. This limited exposure, but it did not eliminate it. Associates made mistakes. Phones were used when they should not have been. Words were chosen carelessly. Each slip added to the picture investigators were building. As months passed, law enforcement patience paid off. The network became clearer. Roles were identified. Supply routes traced. The operation's resilience, once its greatest strength, now served as proof of centralized control. Investigators could argue that this was not a collection of independent actors, but a coordinated enterprise. Ross began to sense pressure indirectly. Associates behaved differently. Some became nervous, others distant. Rumors circulated about informants. Police presence felt more strategic, less random. These signs did not cause panic, but they heightened Ross's vigilance. He tightened routines, reduced contact, and reinforced discipline. Despite these adjustments, the investigation continued to advance. Law enforcement had the advantage of time. They did not need to act quickly. In fact, acting too soon would weaken their case. Each day the operation continued added evidence of scale and intent. Each transaction documented strengthened the argument for conspiracy. The contrast between Ross's world and the investigator's world was stark. On the streets, decisions were immediate and consequences felt quickly. In offices and courtrooms, decisions unfolded slowly, guided by procedure and precedent. Ross operated in the present. Law enforcement built cases for the future. Eventually, the investigation reached a point of critical mass. Enough evidence had been gathered to justify action. Warrants were prepared. Arrest lists finalized. The goal was no longer observation, but dismantling. Timing became crucial. Coordinated arrests would prevent warnings from spreading and preserve evidence. Ross was not yet aware of how close this moment was. From his perspective, the system still held. He had navigated pressure before and believed he could do so again. What he did not see was how comprehensive the investigation had become, how many angles were covered, how patient his adversaries had been. The tightening net was not dramatic. There were no sirens yet, no confrontations. Just a growing sense of inevitability, felt more as tension than fear. Ross trusted his discipline, his structure, his instincts. They had carried him through every previous challenge. But this was different. This was not chaos he could manage or competition he could outmaneuver. This was a slow, deliberate force, moving quietly toward him, guided by evidence rather than impulse. And as the final pieces fell into place, the question was no longer whether law enforcement would act, but when. The calm before that moment was deceptive. The streets continued their uneasy rhythm. Money flowed. Product moved. Life appeared unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, the balance had shifted. The system Ross had built was now fully visible to those determined to dismantle it. In this space between awareness and action, between control and collapse, Ross stood unknowingly at the edge of a turning point. The patience of law enforcement was about to meet the limits of his discipline. And when it did, the consequences would unfold swiftly, reshaping his life in ways no amount of preparation could prevent. Pressure has a way of revealing weaknesses that success keeps hidden. As the investigation surrounding Rick Ross's operation deepened, the first signs of fracture did not come from law enforcement knocking on doors, but from within his own network. Loyalty, which once felt solid enough to rely on, began to thin under the weight of fear. The same discipline that had built the system now demanded more than many people could give, and cracks began to form quietly, one relationship at a time. At first, the changes were subtle. Associates who had once been dependable started missing meetings or arriving late. Communication grew cautious, sometimes evasive. Conversations that used to flow smoothly became clipped, strained by unspoken tension. Ross noticed these shifts immediately. He had always paid close attention to behavior, and behavior now told a story words did not. Something was changing beneath the surface. Fear spread unevenly. Some people became reckless, driven by panic rather than logic. Others withdrew, trying to disappear before attention found them. A few attempted to maintain normal routines, believing that consistency might protect them. Ross understood all of these reactions, but none of them reassured him. Fear was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Rumors of informants began circulating, as they often do in times of pressure. Someone had been seen talking too long with police. Someone else had taken a plea deal. Names surfaced, then vanished. Ross did not react emotionally. He had prepared for this possibility long ago. The question was not if someone would talk, but who, and how much damage they could do. Betrayal in an operation of this size rarely looks dramatic. It is usually quiet, procedural. A conversation in an interview room. A signature on a document. A willingness to trade information for leniency. Those who cooperated often justified their actions as survival, not treachery. Facing long sentences, many chose self-preservation over loyalty to a system that could no longer protect them. Ross responded by tightening his inner circle even further. Access to information was reduced. Roles were narrowed. He limited contact, speaking only when necessary. This defensive posture protected him in the short term, but it also increased strain. The fewer people he trusted, the heavier the burden became. Decisions piled up, and isolation deepened. As informants provided fragments of information, law enforcement began to connect dots more quickly. A name here, a route there, a meeting time that matched surveillance records. Each cooperation accelerated the investigation. Ross could feel this acceleration indirectly. Arrests seemed more targeted. Questions asked by police were more specific. The randomness he once relied on to mask his operation was fading. Internally, tension affected performance. Mistakes increased. Small errors that would have been corrected quietly now carried greater consequences. A missed signal. A delayed delivery. An unfamiliar face appearing where it shouldn't. Ross addressed each issue methodically, but the cumulative effect was draining. Maintaining order required constant attention. Trust, once a stabilizing force, became a liability. Ross found himself questioning motives behind every action. Was a suggestion genuine, or an attempt to gather information? Was silence a sign of discipline, or concealment? This mental strain wore him down, even as he maintained an outward calm. Some associates attempted to reassure him, pledging loyalty and commitment. Ross listened, but he relied more on actions than assurances. Words were easy. Consistency under pressure was rare. Those who faltered were quietly removed from sensitive roles. There were no confrontations, no accusations. Ross believed that reducing exposure was safer than provoking conflict. The emotional cost of this phase was significant. Ross had built his system on predictability and control. Betrayal undermined both. It reminded him that no structure, no matter how disciplined, could fully account for human fear. This realization did not lead to despair, but it did erode his confidence in permanence. As cooperation increased, law enforcement began to understand not just the structure of the operation, but its culture. They learned how decisions were made, how discipline was enforced, how information flowed. This insight allowed them to anticipate responses, closing gaps Ross had relied on for years. Ross sensed that the balance was shifting. He increased precautions, altered routines, and considered scaling back. Yet scaling back carried its own risks. Reduced activity could signal awareness, prompting faster action from investigators. Continuing as usual maintained appearances, but also added evidence. There was no clear path that guaranteed safety. The network, once resilient, now felt brittle. Each arrest reverberated more strongly. Each rumor carried more weight. Ross watched as individuals he had once trusted faced choices he could not make for them. He understood their fear, even as he recognized the damage it caused. Late at night, when the city quieted, Ross reflected on the nature of loyalty. He had never believed in blind allegiance. He had built his operation on discipline, not devotion. Yet even discipline had limits when confronted with the threat of decades behind bars. The realization was sobering. Despite this, Ross did not panic. Panic was another form of loss of control. He believed that maintaining order, even in decline, was essential. He continued to operate, adjusting constantly, minimizing exposure where possible. His instincts told him that sudden changes would do more harm than good. As more people cooperated, the investigation gained momentum. Law enforcement no longer relied solely on surveillance, they now had voices from within the operation. These voices filled in gaps, confirmed suspicions, and strengthened the case. Ross's system, once opaque, was becoming transparent. The emotional distance Ross maintained from others widened further. He withdrew into himself, focusing on analysis rather than connection. This withdrawal protected him from betrayal's sting, but it also deepened his isolation. He carried the weight alone, believing that sharing it would only create new vulnerabilities. In this phase, the fall did not feel dramatic. It felt gradual, like erosion. Each small loss weakened the foundation. Ross remained standing, but the ground beneath him was shifting. He could sense it, even if he could not see the full extent. The operation continued to function, but its rhythm had changed. Movements were more cautious. Decisions slower. The confidence that once defined it had been replaced by vigilance. Ross knew that the window for control was narrowing. Betrayal, once an abstract possibility, had become a lived reality. It was not fueled by malice, but by fear. This distinction did not soften its impact. It only made it more inevitable. As the network strained under pressure, Ross faced a truth he had long avoided: no system could outpace time indefinitely. The discipline that built his empire was now being tested by forces it was never designed to withstand. And as the fractures widened, the end moved closer, not with chaos, but with quiet certainty. The moment did not arrive with the drama one might expect. There were no flashing lights cutting through the night, no frantic chase through crowded streets. Instead, it came with a stillness that felt almost unreal, as if time itself had slowed in acknowledgement of what was about to happen. For Rick Ross, the arrest was not a sudden shock so much as the quiet confirmation of a pressure he had felt building for a long time. The freeways that once symbolized movement and control now seemed distant, unreachable, as the world he had managed so carefully closed in around him. By this point, Ross had learned to read signs most people overlooked. He sensed when associates grew nervous, when conversations shortened, when routines felt heavier than usual. Yet even with this awareness, there was no clear moment when he could say the end had arrived. The machinery of law enforcement does not announce itself. It appears when preparation is complete, when options have narrowed, when resistance no longer serves a purpose. When agents finally moved, it was with precision. Warrants were executed simultaneously, designed to prevent warnings from spreading through the network. Doors opened not to chaos, but to controlled authority. Ross was taken into custody without spectacle. The calmness of the process was striking. Years of movement, calculation, and control were reduced to a few measured steps, a set of restraints, and the quiet realization that the system he had built was no longer his to manage. In the immediate aftermath, Ross's instincts took over. He remained composed, saying little, observing everything. This discipline had carried him through countless challenges, and he relied on it now. Panic would not change the outcome. Words could only complicate matters. Silence, he believed, was still his strongest defense. The transition from freedom to confinement was disorienting in its simplicity. One moment he was navigating a world defined by movement and decision-making, the next he was seated in a holding area, stripped of autonomy. The contrast was stark. Control, once absolute within his sphere, vanished instantly. Schedules were no longer his to set. Space was limited. Time stretched differently. As hours passed, Ross began to grasp the scope of what was unfolding. Arrests across the network. Seizures. Interviews. The system he had compartmentalized so carefully was being exposed layer by layer. He understood this intellectually, but emotionally, it felt distant. Years of compartmentalization had trained him to focus narrowly, to deal with immediate realities rather than abstract consequences. Interrogations followed, measured and methodical. Investigators presented fragments of information, testing reactions, probing for inconsistencies. Ross listened without responding, recognizing familiar tactics. He had anticipated this phase, though never fully imagined how it would feel to be on the receiving end. The balance of power had shifted completely. News of the arrest spread quickly through the streets and beyond. For those who had depended on the operation, the impact was immediate. Confusion replaced routine. Fear intensified. The system that once absorbed disruption now became the disruption. Ross was aware of this, yet powerless to intervene. The realization that his influence had ended was both sobering and surreal. The legal process moved forward steadily. Charges were formalized. Evidence compiled. The scale of the case became clearer with each passing day. Ross faced the weight of what investigators had built over years of surveillance, cooperation, and analysis. Numbers that once represented profit now represented counts, timelines, and conspiracies. His own efficiency had been translated into evidence. Emotionally, Ross remained restrained. There were no outbursts, no visible despair. He had always believed that emotion clouded judgment, and he held to that belief now. Yet beneath the surface, a profound shift was taking place. The future he had envisioned, whatever its risks, had vanished. In its place was uncertainty of a different kind, defined not by strategy, but by procedure. As he was processed through the system, Ross encountered the reality of incarceration. The sounds, the routines, the absence of privacy. These details, mundane to those accustomed to them, felt heavy and unfamiliar. The world had narrowed abruptly, reduced to immediate surroundings and the passage of time. In quiet moments, Ross reflected on how quickly control could dissolve. Years of discipline, planning, and vigilance had not prevented this outcome. They had delayed it, perhaps, but not avoided it. This realization did not bring regret in the conventional sense. Instead, it brought clarity. He had always known the risks. He had simply believed he could manage them indefinitely. The arrest also forced Ross to confront the difference between power and permanence. His influence had been vast, but it had existed within a fragile balance. Once that balance tipped, everything changed. The streets moved on without him. New systems emerged. Life continued, indifferent to his absence. As days turned into weeks, Ross began to understand that this was not a temporary setback. The charges carried severe consequences. The possibility of freedom, once taken for granted, became uncertain. He prepared himself mentally for what lay ahead, drawing on the same discipline that had defined his rise. The stillness of confinement offered an unfamiliar space for reflection. Without constant demands, Ross found himself revisiting earlier chapters of his life. The tennis courts. The early hustles. The decisions that had seemed small at the time. Each step, logical on its own, had led here. The chain of cause and effect was impossible to ignore. Yet even in this reflection, Ross did not indulge in self-pity. He viewed his situation with the same pragmatic lens he had applied to everything else. This was the consequence of choices made within a specific environment, under specific pressures. Understanding that did not absolve responsibility, but it provided context. The arrest marked the definitive end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. The identity he had crafted, quiet, controlled, invisible, no longer served him. In its place was a new reality, one governed by rules he did not set and outcomes he could not influence. As the legal process continued, Ross settled into a rhythm defined by waiting. Waiting for hearings. Waiting for decisions. Waiting for clarity. This waiting was perhaps the most difficult adjustment. Accustomed to constant movement and decision-making, he now existed in suspension. The freeways that once symbolized freedom and flow faded into memory. In their place were corridors and cells, routines enforced rather than chosen. Ross had reached the point where discipline was no longer a tool for control, but a means of endurance. The arrest closed a chapter defined by expansion and power. What followed would test Ross in ways his rise never had. The skills that built his empire would need to be reshaped for survival in a world where control was no longer his to command. The courtroom was a different kind of battlefield, one where time moved slowly and words carried more weight than action ever had. For Rick Ross, this environment felt unfamiliar and strangely constricting. The pace was deliberate, governed by procedure rather than instinct. Every motion was measured. Every statement recorded. The chaos and urgency of the streets had been replaced by formality and restraint, and in this setting, Ross was no longer the one setting the rhythm. As the trial began to take shape, the scope of the case became impossible to ignore. What Ross had once viewed as an efficient operation was now presented as a sprawling conspiracy. Prosecutors laid out timelines, diagrams, and testimonies, translating years of movement into charts and exhibits. The same structure that had protected him was now being used to demonstrate intent and control. Efficiency, once his greatest asset, had been reframed as evidence of leadership. Ross listened quietly as witnesses spoke. Some were strangers. Others were familiar names, people who had once played roles within his network. Hearing their words in this context was jarring. Stories he knew from the inside were retold in fragments, filtered through fear, deals, and self-preservation. He did not react outwardly. Emotion, he believed, would not change the outcome. Still, each testimony carried a weight that settled slowly. The prosecution emphasized scale. Numbers were repeated again and again, quantities of drugs, amounts of money, years of activity. These figures were meant to convey impact, to show not just wrongdoing, but magnitude. Ross recognized the strategy. The larger the operation appeared, the harsher the consequences would likely be. What had once felt abstract now felt personal. Defense arguments focused on gaps, on uncertainty, on the limits of what could be proven. They challenged credibility, questioned motives, and highlighted the absence of direct evidence tying Ross to every action described. Ross understood these arguments intellectually, but he also understood the reality of federal cases. They were built patiently, layered carefully, designed to withstand challenge. Hope existed, but it was fragile. As the trial progressed, Ross became acutely aware of how little control he had. Decisions were made beyond his reach, influenced by laws, precedents, and perceptions. The outcome would depend not on strategy, but on interpretation. This loss of agency was perhaps the hardest adjustment. For years, Ross had shaped outcomes through discipline and planning. Here, those tools had limited power. The courtroom atmosphere was calm, almost subdued, yet the stakes were immense. Ross watched as jurors listened, their expressions unreadable. He wondered what they saw when they looked at him. A criminal mastermind. A symbol of devastation. Or simply a man caught in a system larger than himself. He would never know. When the verdict arrived, it did so without ceremony. Guilty. The word landed with quiet finality. Ross absorbed it without visible reaction. He had prepared himself for this possibility, even if he had hoped for another outcome. The next phase, sentencing, loomed larger than the verdict itself. Sentencing hearings unfolded with the same measured pace. Prosecutors argued for severity, emphasizing the harm caused, the lives affected, the scale of the operation. They spoke of deterrence and accountability, of sending a message. Ross listened, aware that this narrative would shape his future more than any personal explanation he could offer. When it was time for Ross to speak, his words were restrained. He did not attempt to justify his actions or shift blame. He acknowledged responsibility without dramatization. His tone reflected acceptance rather than defiance. This was not an act of surrender, but an acknowledgement of reality. The sentence, when delivered, was staggering. Life in prison. The words echoed in the room, heavy and irreversible. Ross felt their weight settle slowly. Life. The concept was difficult to grasp in practical terms. It meant an end to the world he knew, an indefinite horizon defined by confinement. The courtroom reacted quietly. There were no outbursts, no visible celebrations. The moment passed with procedural calm. Ross was led away, the finality of the sentence trailing behind him like a shadow. Years of movement and influence had been reduced to a single outcome. In the days that followed, Ross grappled with the meaning of the sentence. Life imprisonment was not just a punishment, it was a redefinition of existence. The future he had imagined, whatever its risks, was gone. In its place was an uncharted reality, one that demanded endurance rather than ambition. As he was transferred into the prison system, Ross observed the routines and hierarchies that governed this new world. Discipline, once a tool for control, became a necessity for survival. The skills he had honed, observation, restraint, adaptation, would need to be repurposed. Emotionally, Ross experienced a mix of resignation and resolve. There was grief for what was lost, though he rarely named it as such. There was also a determination to endure, to find meaning within limitation. He had always believed in structure. Now, he would need to build one internally. The sentence also forced Ross to confront the broader impact of his actions. In court, harm had been quantified and described. In confinement, there was space to reflect on what those descriptions meant. This reflection was not immediate or complete. It unfolded slowly, in fragments, as the noise of the outside world faded. Life in prison stripped away distractions. Time stretched. Days blurred into routines. Ross found himself revisiting earlier decisions, not with regret alone, but with analysis. He traced the path from small hustles to life imprisonment, understanding how each step, logical in isolation, contributed to the outcome. The contrast between power and powerlessness became stark. Ross had once influenced cities. Now, his world was measured in cells and schedules. This contrast was humbling, though he did not articulate it that way. He accepted it as another reality to navigate. The life sentence marked the definitive end of Rick Ross the Kingpin. Whatever identity he would build next would have to exist within walls. The courtroom chapter closed quietly, but its consequences would echo for decades. As Ross settled into this new existence, one truth became clear: discipline alone could not undo the past, but it could shape how he faced the future. The sentence had taken his freedom, but it had not taken his capacity to adapt. In that narrow space, between acceptance and endurance, a new chapter began, defined not by control over others, but by control over himself. Prison life began not with drama, but with repetition. Days followed one another in a steady, unbroken rhythm that felt designed to erase urgency and flatten time. For Rick Ross, this environment was disorienting in a way no courtroom or holding cell had been. There were no deals to negotiate, no routes to adjust, no systems to refine. The world had narrowed to schedules posted on walls, counts announced over loudspeakers, and routines enforced without exception. Control, once the central force of his life, was now external. The early months were the hardest. The loss of autonomy was absolute. Simple decisions, when to eat, where to stand, when to move, were no longer his to make. Ross had spent years shaping his environment through discipline and foresight. Now he existed within a structure that did not bend to individual will. This reality required a recalibration of identity. Survival depended not on influence, but on adaptation. Ross approached prison the way he had approached every other unfamiliar system, by observing. He watched how inmates interacted, how conflicts formed and dissolved, how respect was earned and lost. Prison had its own rules, unspoken yet rigid. Loudness attracted trouble. Emotional volatility invited exploitation. Those who lasted were those who remained steady, predictable, and controlled. These principles felt familiar. One of the most significant challenges Ross faced was mental. The pace of prison life left ample space for thought, and thought could be dangerous. Without constant demands to distract him, memories surfaced more easily. Scenes from his past, streets, conversations, decisions, replayed with new clarity. At first, this reflection felt intrusive. Over time, it became unavoidable. Ross realized quickly that idleness was a threat. Without structure, days blurred into each other, eroding purpose. He needed an anchor. For the first time in his life, the limitation that had shaped so many of his choices came into focus, his inability to read. In the free world, he had adapted around it. In prison, it stood as a barrier between him and the few resources available for growth. Learning to read as an adult, in a prison environment, was humbling. Ross approached it with the same discipline he once applied to building his operation. He started slowly, with basic words and repetition. Progress was uneven and often frustrating. There were moments of embarrassment, moments when the gap between him and others felt painfully wide. Yet he persisted. Education became more than a skill, it became a form of resistance. Each word learned represented a small reclaiming of agency. Reading opened doors Ross had never accessed before. Books offered perspectives he had not considered, histories he had not known, explanations for systems he had navigated without understanding. Knowledge reframed his past, not to excuse it, but to contextualize it. Prison routines, once oppressive, became frameworks Ross could work within. He established personal schedules, allocating time for reading, exercise, and reflection. This self-imposed order restored a sense of control, even if limited. Discipline, repurposed, became a tool for endurance rather than expansion. Interactions with other inmates were cautious but respectful. Ross did not advertise his past, nor did he deny it. He understood that reputation in prison could be as dangerous as it was protective. He chose neutrality, offering neither intimidation nor vulnerability. This balance allowed him to move through the environment without unnecessary conflict. Over time, Ross noticed a shift in his thinking. The urgency that once defined his life faded. Without constant pressure to act, he began to see his story with greater distance. He recognized patterns not just in his operation, but in the system that had shaped it. Poverty, lack of education, limited opportunity, these factors, once background noise, became clearer through reflection and study. This did not lead to absolution. Ross did not deny the harm caused by his actions. Addiction, violence, broken families, these realities weighed on him more heavily in the quiet of confinement. Yet he resisted simplistic narratives of villainy or heroism. His life, he came to see, was the product of choices made within constraints, choices that carried consequences far beyond their initial context. Prison also exposed Ross to stories unlike his own. Men from different backgrounds, different crimes, different paths. Listening to them broadened his understanding of how many ways lives could be derailed, how often systems failed long before individuals did. These conversations deepened his sense of perspective, even as they reinforced the permanence of his situation. Time in prison moves strangely. Days are long, but years pass quickly. Ross marked progress not by calendar milestones, but by internal change. Reading became easier. Comprehension deepened. He began to articulate thoughts that once existed only as instincts. Language gave shape to reflection, and reflection softened some of the rigidity that had defined him. There were moments of regret, though Ross rarely framed them emotionally. Instead, he analyzed them. What if certain decisions had been different? What if he had recognized limits sooner? These questions did not torment him, they informed him. They became lessons rather than sources of despair. Ross also grappled with identity. Outside, he had been defined by what he controlled. Inside, that definition no longer applied. He had to build a sense of self not rooted in influence or fear. Education, routine, and reflection provided the foundation for this new identity. It was quieter, less visible, but more stable. As years passed, Ross's reputation within the prison shifted. He was seen not as a threat, but as someone disciplined, thoughtful, and focused. He assisted others where he could, particularly those struggling with literacy. Teaching reinforced his own learning and offered a sense of purpose that had been absent. The prison system remained unforgiving. Life sentences cast long shadows. Hope, when it appeared, was cautious. Ross did not allow himself to dwell on possibilities of release. Instead, he focused on what he could control, his response to confinement. This acceptance was not resignation, but realism. In moments of solitude, Ross considered how education might have changed his path had it been accessible earlier. This thought carried sadness, but also resolve. If knowledge had been denied to him before, he would claim it now. Learning became an act of defiance against the circumstances that had limited him. The man who entered prison had been defined by systems of his own making. The man who emerged internally, over years of confinement, was shaped by systems he could not escape. In adapting to them, Ross discovered a different kind of strength, one rooted not in control over others, but in mastery of self. Life behind bars stripped away illusions. It reduced existence to essentials. Within that reduction, Ross found space to change. Not dramatically, not quickly, but steadily. The empire was gone. The noise had faded. What remained was time, and within time, the possibility of understanding. Prison did not erase Rick Ross's past. It did not absolve him. But it transformed how he carried it. In learning to read, to reflect, to endure, Ross began to rewrite his relationship with his own story. The walls remained. The sentence remained. Yet within those constraints, a quieter evolution took place, one that would shape whatever future awaited him, whether behind bars or beyond them. Even as Rick Ross adjusted to the rhythms of prison life, the world outside continued to shift in ways he could not control. Among the many forces that intersected with his story, few were as transformative, or as controversial, as the work of journalist Gary Webb. Webb's investigation, quietly undertaken in the early 1990s, would thrust Ross's name, and the broader crack epidemic, into a storm of national scrutiny. It was a story that extended beyond the streets, beyond prison walls, and into the complex intersections of politics, economics, and media influence. For Ross, this revelation arrived as both validation and complication, illuminating aspects of his life he had never fully seen and challenging narratives long taken for granted. Webb approached the story with meticulous care, following threads that few others had pursued. He examined patterns of cocaine distribution, traced supply lines from Central America, and explored the impact of U.S. foreign policy in regions like Nicaragua. Slowly, a narrative emerged, that the flow of drugs into American cities, including the quantities that had passed through Ross's operation, may have been influenced by covert interests beyond the street. The implications were staggering. For decades, the crack epidemic had been framed as a moral failure, a series of personal choices gone wrong. Webb's reporting suggested something far more complex, a convergence of individual action, systemic neglect, and hidden political agendas. For many, the story was both illuminating and infuriating. Communities devastated by addiction and violence struggled to reconcile the notion that their suffering could have been shaped not only by local dealers but also by forces operating thousands of miles away. Ross's role, already complicated by his scale and influence, now took on a new dimension. He was both a participant and, unintentionally, a symbol of larger systemic failures. While he had acted within the frameworks available to him, external factors had amplified the reach and consequences of his actions in ways he had neither intended nor controlled. The reaction from the media and the public was swift and polarized. Some viewed Webb's work as courageous, exposing a truth that had long been ignored. Others dismissed it, suggesting exaggeration or conspiracy. The backlash was particularly pronounced within mainstream journalism, with major outlets questioning Webb's methodology and conclusions. Yet the story persisted, amplified by communities directly affected and by scholars seeking to understand the broader implications of the crack epidemic. For Ross, this external debate highlighted a reality he had always understood but rarely confronted, that the consequences of his operation were inseparable from the social, political, and economic environments in which it existed. Within prison, Ross observed the unfolding coverage quietly. He was aware of his role in the narrative but maintained the mental distance he had cultivated over years of confinement. The headlines, analyses, and debates felt both distant and intimately connected to his life. He was a central figure, yet the discussion extended far beyond him, encompassing policies, political decisions, and institutional failures that shaped the environment in which his empire had grown. The story reframed his experience, placing him within a complex web of accountability and influence. Webb's investigation also revealed the public's appetite for understanding causality beyond individual blame. For years, Ross and others in his position had been painted solely as architects of destruction. This narrative ignored systemic inequalities, economic pressures, and historical context that had created fertile ground for the drug trade. Through Webb's reporting, new questions emerged. How much of the epidemic was the result of deliberate actions versus neglect? To what extent did government policies, international conflicts, and institutional oversight shape outcomes that Ross alone could not control? These questions did not absolve him, but they expanded the framework in which his story was understood. The controversy surrounding Webb's reporting also influenced perceptions of Ross within the prison system. Fellow inmates, staff, and visitors encountered a version of his life that blended street legend with national debate. Ross observed how narratives could shift reputations, altering how people perceived him without altering the facts of his day-to-day existence. This realization reinforced lessons he had learned long ago: perception is as powerful as reality, and control over the latter does not guarantee influence over the former. As the debate intensified, Ross also recognized the fragility of public memory. Stories evolve, facts are interpreted through bias, and history is written by those with the loudest platforms. Webb's work challenged established narratives, creating space for nuance and reflection. For Ross, this was both validating and unsettling. His life had always been examined narrowly, through criminal records, arrests, and media portrayals focused on sensational aspects. Now, it was being reframed within broader societal forces, raising questions that extended far beyond individual culpability. The public reckoning catalyzed by Webb's investigation also highlighted a tension inherent in systemic failures: accountability versus structural causation. Communities demanded justice, policymakers sought explanations, and journalists attempted to trace origins. Ross's operation was central to the discussion, yet it existed alongside a constellation of factors that had amplified its reach. For him, this juxtaposition underscored a complex truth: the consequences of individual action are inseparable from context, and understanding context often challenges simple moral judgments. Webb's work, though controversial, forced a re-examination of responsibility. It suggested that while Ross and other dealers bore immediate accountability, the societal environment, shaped by poverty, limited education, foreign policy, and governmental oversight, played a decisive role in magnifying impact. This perspective reframed discussions of crime and punishment, shifting some attention from individual failings to systemic conditions. For Ross, the implications were profound. His life, once interpreted primarily through acts of commerce and control, now became a lens through which to examine structural injustice. Within this reframed narrative, Ross began to see his story differently. The rise of his empire, the scale of distribution, and the visibility of his operations were no longer isolated phenomena. They were intertwined with a network of policies, political interests, and historical forces that had shaped demand, supply, and enforcement. Understanding this did not mitigate personal responsibility, but it contextualized it, allowing Ross to reflect on his past with a deeper awareness of the broader forces at play. The controversy also highlighted the limits of visibility and control. Ross had always been adept at managing what he could see, adjusting to patterns, and anticipating consequences. Webb's investigation reminded him that some forces are invisible, operating beyond immediate perception yet shaping outcomes in profound ways. For someone who had built an empire on understanding and manipulation of systems, this realization was both sobering and instructive. Over time, the debate surrounding Webb's reporting would influence public discourse on drug policy, criminal justice, and the social consequences of foreign intervention. Ross's story, situated within this debate, evolved from a tale of individual criminality to a case study in systemic interaction, demonstrating how individual action interacts with broader social, political, and economic forces. This reframing expanded the understanding of his life and legacy, complicating simplistic narratives of good and evil. Ultimately, Gary Webb's work forced the world to confront uncomfortable questions: how much responsibility lies with individuals, and how much with the systems that shape choices? How do external forces, political, economic, and social, interact with personal ambition and opportunity? For Ross, these questions did not change the reality of incarceration, nor did they erase the consequences of his decisions. But they did provide perspective, a framework in which to understand the extraordinary complexity of his experience. In reflecting on Webb's investigation, Ross could see the ripple effects of his actions intertwined with forces far beyond his immediate control. The story extended across cities, nations, and policies, illuminating the intersections of personal ambition, systemic neglect, and historical circumstance. Even behind prison walls, Ross could perceive that his life had become part of a broader narrative, one that challenged assumptions, provoked debate, and demanded a deeper understanding of cause, consequence, and accountability. After decades behind bars, the concept of freedom became almost surreal for Rick Ross. Prison had compressed time into routine and ritual, each day defined by schedules, counts, and controlled interactions. The world outside, once familiar, had moved on without him, reshaped by years of social change, economic shifts, and the evolution of the drug trade he had once dominated. To imagine stepping back into it required both courage and an almost abstract detachment, as if preparing to inhabit a life that no longer fully existed. Release was not merely the lifting of walls, it was the reintroduction into a world that had become foreign, a landscape that had evolved in ways he could not fully anticipate. The process of sentence reduction, painstaking and bureaucratic, unfolded quietly. It was not sudden, nor dramatic. Years of appeals, legal advocacy, and shifts in policy coalesced to offer the possibility of a second chance. Each milestone was celebrated privately, without fanfare, understood only by those intimately familiar with the mechanics of the prison system. For Ross, the incremental nature of these developments mirrored his approach to business decades earlier: patient, methodical, and calculated, yet accompanied by an undercurrent of tension. When the decision finally arrived that he would be released, the anticipation was tempered by decades of adaptation to confinement. Ross had lived in a world governed by external control for so long that the idea of autonomy was simultaneously exhilarating and disorienting. He had developed habits, mental frameworks, and coping strategies suited to a controlled environment. These patterns, once protective, now required recalibration. Freedom was no longer a return to his old life, it was the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one that demanded careful navigation. Stepping outside the prison gates, Ross was greeted by a city he recognized yet did not fully know. Streets had shifted, new businesses and neighborhoods had emerged, and the social dynamics he once understood had been altered by years of change. The freeways he had once traversed as arteries of commerce now seemed to carry only memory. The scale of his former influence had diminished in his absence, replaced by systems that continued independently. For Ross, this was a stark lesson in impermanence. Control can be absolute in one context, yet ephemeral in another. The emotional landscape of release was complex. There was relief, certainly, but also apprehension. The physical act of leaving prison did not erase the years lost or the distance created between him and the society he had left behind. Ross had to reconcile the person he had become within confinement with the expectations, assumptions, and realities of life outside. This tension was compounded by public perception. His notoriety had not faded, if anything, it had solidified into legend, mythologized through media, documentaries, and ongoing discourse about the crack epidemic. Freedom, in this sense, was both liberation and exposure. Reintegration demanded practical adaptation. Ross had to navigate legal obligations, societal expectations, and the logistical complexities of establishing a life outside prison walls. Employment, housing, and social networks were no longer familiar territories but arenas requiring strategic engagement. Skills honed in one context, street-level intelligence, organizational discipline, risk management, needed translation into socially acceptable, constructive avenues. Each step of reintegration was measured, deliberate, and informed by the lessons learned from decades of survival under constraint. Public attention added another layer of complexity. Ross's story had become a cultural touchstone, a reference point in discussions of crime, policy, and systemic inequality. Interviews, media requests, and inquiries required careful management. He could not interact with the world as an invisible figure, yet visibility carried risks. Reputation, once maintained through discretion and compartmentalization, now needed navigation within a society eager to interpret, judge, and contextualize his life. Ross approached this cautiously, balancing openness with protection, understanding that every statement could ripple widely. In parallel, Ross sought avenues to redefine identity. The life of crime that had once defined him could not be resumed, and the skills that had once supported it required repurposing. Public speaking, education, and advocacy emerged as possibilities, avenues through which he could leverage experience without repeating past harms. These efforts were not driven by redemption alone, but by pragmatism, a recognition that knowledge, discipline, and insight could provide value in socially constructive ways. Ross approached these roles with the same methodical approach that had characterized his earlier career. Emotionally, the transition demanded reflection and recalibration. Prison had fostered introspection, literacy, and analytical thinking. Freedom, however, brought immediacy and sensory complexity, the rush of urban environments, the unpredictability of human interaction, and the pressure to engage in ways that were both meaningful and safe. Ross had to integrate decades of internalized structure with the fluidity of external reality. This process required patience, self-awareness, and the continued application of discipline, now oriented toward adaptation rather than control. Relationships posed another set of challenges. Family, friends, and former associates had aged, shifted, or moved on. Ross had to rebuild trust, navigate expectations, and re-establish bonds within a social fabric altered by time. Emotional intelligence, negotiation, and patience became critical tools. The world outside demanded engagement, yet boundaries were essential for maintaining stability. Ross approached these dynamics carefully, recognizing that misalignment could jeopardize both personal well-being and emerging opportunities. Financial considerations were equally pressing. While decades in prison had preserved knowledge of operations and logistics, capital accumulation had not been possible in the same way as before. Ross needed to translate strategic thinking into legally sanctioned income streams. This required creativity, leverage of reputation, and partnerships with those willing to collaborate within lawful frameworks. Each decision carried weight, balancing the desire for security with the necessity of compliance and sustainability. The broader social context also required navigation. Communities that had experienced the crack epidemic remained deeply affected. Ross's name, often invoked in discussions of systemic failure, carried symbolic weight. His actions were part of collective memory, intertwined with narratives of harm and survival. Engaging with these communities demanded sensitivity, accountability, and an understanding of historical impact. Ross had to reconcile his lived experience with public perception, a negotiation that required honesty, humility, and strategic communication. Freedom also brought opportunities for reflection on legacy. Ross could examine the trajectory of his life with perspective unavailable within prison walls. He could trace patterns, identify decisions that had escalated risk, and consider how systems beyond his control shaped outcomes. This reflection was neither simplistic nor moralistic, it was analytical, focused on understanding cause, consequence, and context. By engaging with these insights, Ross could influence public discourse, contribute to education, and offer lessons drawn from experience. In practical terms, re-entry required incremental adaptation. Ross approached each day with deliberate attention to routine, balance, and structure. Habits formed in prison, discipline, observation, reflection, became tools for navigating freedom. Unlike his earlier life, where spontaneity and improvisation were often necessary, the post-release phase demanded careful planning, anticipation of consequences, and strategic engagement with systems beyond his immediate control. Ultimately, Ross's release was not simply liberation from physical confinement. It represented the beginning of a second life, one defined by adaptation, responsibility, and the reapplication of knowledge acquired through decades of survival. Autonomy, once absolute in the context of his street empire, now had to coexist with societal expectations, legal constraints, and the realities of public scrutiny. This transition required patience, resilience, and the continued cultivation of skills he had honed under very different circumstances. Freedom brought complexity, opportunity, and risk in equal measure. Ross's path forward was neither guaranteed nor predetermined. Each decision, relationship, and engagement carried potential for growth or setback. Yet, armed with decades of experience in strategy, discipline, and observation, he approached this new chapter with the same meticulous care that had characterized his life from the earliest hustles on the streets of South-Central Los Angeles. The challenges were vast, but so too was the opportunity for reinvention, reflection, and measured influence in a world that had moved on without him. Even after regaining his freedom, Rick Ross faced a landscape that had changed almost beyond recognition. The streets of Los Angeles, once the central hub of his operations, had evolved. Neighborhoods had been rebuilt, new businesses had emerged, and social dynamics had shifted under the influence of decades-long policy changes, economic developments, and cultural transformation. The world he had once navigated with instinct and strategy now required adaptation to rules and norms far removed from the environment that had shaped his rise. Freedom was no longer a simple matter of movement, it was a negotiation with a society whose structures he had previously circumvented. The first challenge Ross confronted was reintegration into social networks. Friends and family had aged, relocated, or developed lives without him. Connections that had once been casual or transactional now carried layers of expectation and history. Rebuilding relationships required patience, discretion, and an understanding of the emotional and psychological distance created by decades of confinement. For someone whose early life had been defined by calculation and observation, human unpredictability presented both an opportunity for growth and a potential risk. Public perception added another layer of complexity. Over the years, Ross had become a symbol, sometimes vilified, sometimes mythologized. His notoriety had grown through media coverage, investigative reporting, and cultural references. While this visibility carried potential for influence, it also imposed limitations. Every interaction, every public appearance, every statement risked misinterpretation. Ross needed to navigate these dynamics carefully, balancing authenticity with self-preservation. One avenue for adaptation was education and public engagement. In prison, Ross had honed literacy and analytical skills that allowed him to process complex information, understand systems, and anticipate consequences. These capabilities became tools for rebuilding life outside, enabling him to engage in interviews, write, and participate in discussions about social issues. Education, which had once been inaccessible, now served as both empowerment and protection, equipping him to navigate a society that had evolved in his absence. Re-entry into the workforce required creative thinking. Skills developed during his years of operational management, organization, logistics, strategic planning, needed translation into legitimate opportunities. Ross began exploring roles that leveraged his experience without reproducing past harms. This included public speaking, mentorship, and advocacy. Each engagement demanded careful consideration of message, audience, and potential impact, reinforcing a pattern of discipline and foresight reminiscent of his earlier life, but now oriented toward constructive influence. Emotional adjustment was another critical dimension. Decades of incarceration had instilled resilience, patience, and self-discipline, but they had also conditioned Ross to rely on structure imposed externally. Freedom required him to self-regulate in an environment defined by unpredictability. Simple tasks, navigating urban spaces, making financial decisions, engaging with institutions, carried both opportunity and uncertainty. Each choice demanded reflection, strategy, and adaptability. Ross also confronted the social consequences of his past actions. Communities affected by the crack epidemic still bore the scars of addiction, violence, and systemic neglect. While his personal involvement was only one component of a larger picture, it remained highly visible. Engaging with these communities required empathy, awareness, and a careful framing of his narrative. Ross approached this with humility, recognizing that influence carried responsibility, even decades later. Legal obligations remained a constant factor. Conditions of release, monitoring, and potential civil or criminal consequences imposed constraints on mobility and activity. Ross needed to navigate these requirements meticulously, balancing compliance with the desire for autonomy. His prior experience with rules and discipline provided a framework for managing these complexities, allowing him to operate effectively within boundaries that were both protective and restrictive. The psychological dimension of freedom was profound. Ross had spent decades in an environment where identity was defined by survival, observation, and strategic decision-making. Outside, identity required negotiation with social, legal, and cultural norms that had shifted during his incarceration. He faced the challenge of reconciling the man he had become with the world he had left behind, integrating resilience with adaptability, knowledge with humility, and experience with foresight. Public attention continued to shape opportunities and constraints. Interviews, media appearances, and public engagements offered platforms for influence but also carried scrutiny. Every statement had potential to reshape narratives about his life, the crack epidemic, and systemic failures. Ross learned to approach communication with strategic awareness, balancing transparency, caution, and ethical responsibility. Words became a tool not only for expression but also for managing public perception and social impact. Financial independence became a central concern. With past avenues no longer accessible, Ross needed to create sustainable, lawful means of support. Leveraging knowledge of logistics, negotiation, and operational planning, he explored ventures that allowed him to exercise agency without compromising legal or ethical standards. This phase demanded patience, diligence, and creative problem-solving, echoing the strategic discipline that had characterized his rise, but now repurposed toward constructive ends. Mentorship emerged as another pathway for adaptation. Ross possessed unique insight into systemic inequality, the dynamics of addiction, and the consequences of unchecked criminal enterprises. By sharing experience with younger generations, he could influence outcomes without direct engagement in illicit activity. This role required careful calibration, providing guidance without imposing, offering lessons without judgment, and translating experience into actionable wisdom for those navigating environments that had once shaped him. At the same time, Ross had to navigate the enduring stigma of his past. Society often frames redemption and reintegration in binary terms, success or failure, guilt or absolution. Ross operated in the interstices, understanding that legacy and opportunity exist along a spectrum shaped by both personal choice and systemic context. His approach combined accountability with pragmatism, leveraging insight while acknowledging limits imposed by history and perception. Freedom also allowed Ross to engage in reflective exploration. Decades of confinement had afforded him the ability to analyze systems, understand patterns, and anticipate consequences. Applying this lens to contemporary social and economic landscapes provided insight not only into past mistakes but also into potential contributions. Knowledge acquired through lived experience became a resource for both personal stability and broader social engagement. The balance between adaptation and vigilance remained central. While the immediate threats of incarceration had passed, Ross operated within a complex social environment where missteps could have tangible consequences. Every engagement, personal, professional, or public, required careful consideration. The skills honed over decades of observation, discipline, and strategic thinking were now applied in a context that rewarded patience, foresight, and ethical judgment rather than coercion or control. Ultimately, reintegration was both practical and philosophical. Ross needed to rebuild life on multiple levels: social, economic, emotional, and reputational. Each domain demanded attention, discipline, and reflection. The past provided lessons but did not dictate the future. Freedom, once abstract, had become a series of deliberate choices, each shaping the trajectory of a second life defined not by domination but by adaptation, awareness, and responsibility. In navigating this complex landscape, Ross demonstrated that survival and influence could persist beyond confinement, repurposed toward constructive engagement in a world both familiar and irrevocably changed.